The large concert hall was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the building itself had gone to sleep after a long and tiring day. The bright lights that usually shone on the stage were already turned off, leaving only a few dim bulbs glowing in the corners. The rows of empty seats looked like shadows, stretching far into the darkness. It was the kind of silence where even the smallest sound could be heard clearly. The director of the orchestra, a man known for his sharp ears and perfection in music, was walking slowly through the hall. He had stayed back after a long day of rehearsals to gather some forgotten papers from his office. His footsteps echoed softly against the polished wooden floor. He thought he was the only one inside, alone in the stillness. He was used to the silence at this hour, and nothing usually surprised him. But that night was different. As he reached the end of the corridor, a sound touched his ears. At first it was faint, almost like a memory, gentle notes rising softly in the air. He stopped walking, unsure if he was imagining it. He turned his head slightly, listening more carefully. The sound grew clearer. It was not random noise. It was music, it was Mozart, played with such elegance and control that his heart skipped a beat. The director's eyes narrowed with curiosity. Who could be playing at this late hour? He had dismissed the orchestra members hours ago. No pianist had stayed behind. He knew their schedules, he knew their habits. Yet here was music flowing like water through the empty hall, notes falling one after another, each one full of life and power. He walked slowly, his breath held without realizing. The closer he got, the more he could feel the music surrounding him, wrapping him in a wave of beauty. The piano was not being played in a clumsy way. It was not a beginner striking random keys. No, this was skill, deep skill, the kind that takes years of practice. Each note was alive, each pause perfectly measured. The tempo, the dynamics, everything was in place. Whoever was at the piano was not just playing. They were performing. The director's mind raced. He thought perhaps one of the young pianists had secretly stayed behind. Maybe someone had wanted extra practice, but then again, he knew their styles. This touch, this soul, it felt different. It was emotional, almost aching. As if the pianist was not only playing Mozart, but telling his own story through the music. He stepped carefully, not wanting to break the moment. His shoes tapped against the floor, but the music did not stop. The sound was rising now, stronger, richer, filling the grand hall as if it was alive again. The empty seats no longer looked empty. They looked like an audience, waiting and listening. The director's heart was beating faster. He had judged countless musicians in his life. He had rejected many and guided a few, but what he was hearing now was rare. It was the kind of performance that could move even the coldest heart. It had that invisible magic, that strange power that cannot be taught. It can only come from the soul. He moved closer, his hands almost trembling. As he reached the side of the stage, he saw the piano, standing in the middle like a lonely giant. Its lid was open, its keys shining faintly in the low light, and there, sitting quietly, was not one of his trained pianists, not a guest musician, but a figure he did not expect at all. The person at the piano wore simple clothes that did not belong to a performer. His back was slightly bent, his hands moving with confidence across the keys. The director froze where he stood. His breath caught in his throat. He knew this man. He had seen him many times sweeping the floor, cleaning the stage, carrying buckets. It was the cleaner, the man nobody paid much attention to, the one who moved silently in the background while others shone in the spotlight. And yet here he was, pouring out music that felt as if Mozart himself had returned to life through his fingers. The director could hardly believe his eyes. A shiver ran through him as the last notes of the phrase floated through the air. He wanted to speak, to call out, but the beauty of the music held him still. It was like stumbling upon a hidden treasure, something he was never meant to find, something too rare to disturb in that silent hall at that late hour. One man's secret talent had turned emptiness into wonder. The director stood there, caught between disbelief and awe, wondering how long such brilliance had been hiding right under his nose. Long before that surprising night in the concert hall, the cleaner everyone called Mr. Alvarez had lived a life of quiet routine. To most people, he was just a man in a faded uniform, pushing his mop along the shiny floors, emptying trash bins and carrying buckets of water. He moved quietly, always polite, always humble, never drawing attention to himself. The musicians would pass him by, often without even a nod. For them, he was invisible, part of the background of the grand building. Yet behind his silence was a story that few would ever imagine. Mr. Alvarez was born in a small town where music was like a luxury. His family was poor, his father a laborer, his mother washing clothes for neighbors to earn a little money. They lived in a small house where the roof leaked during rain, where every coin mattered in such a place. Dreams were not easy to keep alive. From a young age, though, he had been drawn to music when he was only a boy. He once passed by a church and heard an old piano playing. He remembered standing at the door for hours. Listening to the sweet notes, his heart raced with wonder. He felt that the instrument was not just wood and strings, but something magical, something alive. From that day on, he knew he wanted to play, but life was not kind. His parents told him gently that lessons were too expensive. That food and rent came first, he understood, but the longing never left him. He used to draw pianos on pieces of paper, pretending to press the keys when he grew older. He found broken keyboards thrown away, some missing keys, some with wires hanging loose. He carried them home and tried to fix them with tape and string. It was never perfect, but for him, even a broken sound was a treasure. Neighbors sometimes laughed, wondering why a poor boy would waste time on such things. They said music would not fill his stomach. But he did not care. Whenever he could, he borrowed records from a kind neighbor, who owned a dusty collection of classical music. He listened again and again, closing his eyes, memorizing every detail. Among all the composers, Mozart touched him the most. The beauty, the energy, the sadness hidden in the joy. It was as if Mozart spoke directly to him. As the years passed, reality pressed harder. He had to find work. He became a cleaner in the city, sweeping in offices, mopping school corridors later. He found a job at the concert hall. At first, he thought it was fate smiling at him, for the hall was filled with pianos, violins, and music. But soon he realized he was not there to play. He was there to clean. Others created art while he scrubbed the floors beneath their feet. Still, he did not complain. He needed the job. He needed the money to survive, and yet in his heart, the music never died. Sometimes, when no one was watching, he would pause in front of the grand piano on stage. He would look at it as if it were an old friend. His fingers would twitch with the memory of keys he had never truly mastered. Then he would turn away, pick up his broom, and continue his work. What made him different was that he never grew bitter. Many in his place might have drowned in regret, but Mr. Alvarez carried his music quietly inside him. It was like a flame that never went out, small but steady, for him. Playing Mozart in his mind while scrubbing the floor was better than no music at all. His coworkers only saw a calm man with kind eyes. They did not know that when he walked home at night, he sometimes hummed entire symphonies to himself. The director and the orchestra had passed him countless times. Yet none of them asked about his life. None of them guessed he carried such passion. To them, he was part of the furniture of the hall, necessary but unnoticed. And Mr. Alvarez accepted this role with humility, for he never thought anyone would care about his past or his love for music. But fate has a strange way of revealing hidden truths. It waits patiently, sometimes for decades, until one unexpected moment brings everything to light. That is why the night when he sat at the piano and played Mozart was not just an accident. It was the release of years of silent practice, of unspoken dreams. The background of Mr. Alvarez's life was not glamorous, not the kind of story newspapers usually celebrate, but it was real, filled with quiet struggle and resilience. He was proof that even in the simplest lives, greatness can be hiding, waiting for the right note, the right time, the right listener. And so, while the world only saw a cleaner, the truth was that Mr. Alvarez was something more, a man who carried Mozart in his heart long before anyone ever heard him touch a piano key. The life of Mr. Alvarez was not easy. Each day began before sunrise, when the city was still half asleep. He would wake up in his small room, wash quickly with cold water, and prepare for another long shift. His clothes were plain, his shoes worn, but he never complained. Work was work, and he was thankful for it. Yet behind the calm face he showed to the world, there was always a quiet storm of longing, a hunger for music that never left him. The concert hall where he worked was a place of beauty. To others it was a temple of art, filled with bright lights, velvet curtains, and the finest musicians, but for him it was mostly a place of duty. He polished the floors so the shoes of performers would shine in the reflections. He dusted the chairs so that the audience could sit in comfort. He emptied bins, fixed small things, and worked silently in the background. Every day as he worked, he watched the orchestra rehearse. The hall would come alive with sound, violins singing, trumpets roaring, cellos humming deeply, and above all, sometimes the piano would take command. Notes would rise into the air and spread like light through the room. Whenever this happened, he slowed down just a little, pretending to sweep but really listening with his heart. Inside him, memories returned. He remembered the broken keyboards of his youth, the scratched records of Mozart that he had played again and again. He remembered how he used to close his eyes and imagine himself sitting on a stage, fingers moving confidently across perfect keys. The sound of the piano in the hall was like a cruel reminder. So close yet so far it hurt him. But it also kept his dream alive. The struggles of his life were many. He worked 2 jobs at one point, cleaning offices at night after finishing his work at the concert hall. Money was always tight. He barely afforded food and rent, let alone music lessons or instruments. Sometimes his hands ached from scrubbing floors. His back hurt from carrying buckets. But he never let go of kindness, never let go of humility. He always greeted others with respect, even if they did not see him as an equal. Musicians often walked past him without a glance, busy with their own careers. They carried sheet music, wore fine clothes, and discussed performances in distant cities. He listened silently, never jealous, but always aware of the great distance between their world and his. To them, he was invisible, a shadow moving with a mop, but in his own mind, he was still connected to the music. There were nights when loneliness pressed hard on him. After long shifts, he would sit alone in his small room, and instead of sleeping, he would hum Mozart softly to himself. He could not afford a piano, but he practiced in silence, moving his fingers on the table as if it were a keyboard. He knew the music by heart, not from notes on a page, but from deep listening. Every phrase was carved in his memory. The struggle was not only financial, but emotional. Imagine loving something with all your soul, yet never being able to touch it. That was his pain. Music was the love of his life. But life had placed him in a role where he could only serve it from the outside, like a man standing outside a house in the rain, looking through the window at the warmth he could never join. Still, he did not give up. Perhaps others would have turned bitter, blaming the world. But he carried his secret passion quietly, almost like a prayer, every day as he worked. He told himself that the music inside him was still alive. Even if nobody else heard it, he heard it. Even if nobody else cared, he cared. And then came the nights when the hall was empty, everyone gone, the lights dim, the silence heavy. Sometimes, when he was sure nobody was watching, he would pause near the piano. His hands would tremble, afraid, longing, tempted. Sometimes he dared to touch the keys gently, pressing 1 note, then 2. The sound would echo in the empty hall, and for a moment he felt whole, but fear would soon return. Fear of being caught, fear of losing his job. He would step back, sigh, and return to his mop. This quiet struggle, repeated again and again, built a weight inside him. He was a man with a hidden gift, trapped in a life that did not allow it to shine. The world saw only his uniform, his broom, his silence. Nobody saw the fire in his soul. But life has a way of testing those who endure, and in the depth of his struggles, Mr. Alvarez was unknowingly preparing himself for the moment when fate would open a door, the day when the director would hear his secret, when the hall would no longer be just a place of work, but the stage where his hidden truth would finally come alive. One night when the concert hall was almost empty, fate gave Mr. Alvarez the chance he had been waiting for all his life. It was late. The orchestra had gone home after a long rehearsal. The director had left as well, or at least that is what Mr. Alvarez thought. The stage was silent, the lights dim, and the grand piano stood uncovered in the center, shining softly under the weak bulbs above. Mr. Alvarez was sweeping near the stage, his old broom moving slowly. His eyes kept drifting toward the piano. It was calling to him, not with words, but with the silent promise of music. He felt his hands tremble, his heart beat faster. He told himself not to be foolish, to finish the cleaning and go home. Yet something inside him refused to listen. Tonight felt different, as if the hall itself was whispering to him. Urging him to sit down, he put the broom aside slowly, as though afraid someone might catch him. He looked around. Every corner was empty, every seat silent. He took a deep breath and walked to the piano. His legs felt heavy, but his soul felt light. When he reached the instrument, he touched the polished wood gently, like greeting an old friend he had not seen in years. He sat down, his body tense. His fingers hovered above the keys, uncertain. He had not played a real piano in many years, only broken keyboards and tables that stood in for them. What if he had forgotten? What if the sound was ugly? He almost stood up. But then he closed his eyes, and inside him, he heard the music he had carried for decades, Mozart, the piece that had lived in his heart since boyhood. And then he began to play. At first the notes came softly, hesitant, like shy footsteps in the dark. But soon his fingers found their strength. They moved with confidence, flowing across the keys as if they had been waiting for this moment. The hall filled with sound, rising and falling like waves. Each phrase was alive, carrying both joy and sorrow. He was not just pressing keys, he was telling his story. A story of longing, of pain, of dreams never spoken. All of it poured out through Mozart's music. The sound grew richer, echoing off the walls. It was as if the empty hall had turned into a grand audience. Every chair listening, every corner vibrating with emotion. The music wrapped around him, lifting him higher than the weight of his uniform, higher than the broom and the mop, higher than the years of silence. For the first time, he felt like the man he had always wanted to be, not a cleaner, but a musician. He forgot about the world outside. He forgot about his tired body. He forgot about fear. There was only the piano, only the music. His eyes stayed closed, but his heart was wide open. Every note came from memory, not from sheet music. He had never learned to read the notes, but he knew them by soul, by listening, by living with them in his heart for so long. Meanwhile, in another part of the hall, the director had returned. He had left some important papers in his office, and he had come back to retrieve them. As he walked through the corridor, he froze. The sound of music reached him, pure and powerful. His first thought was confusion. Who could be playing at this hour? His second thought was wonder, because the performance was extraordinary. The director moved quietly, following the sound. The closer he got, the more stunned he became. This was not an ordinary rehearsal. This was not a student practicing. This was music alive with soul. It was Mozart, played as if every note was personal. He held his breath and stepped closer to the stage. Then he saw him. The sight struck him like lightning. It was not one of his pianists, not a guest performer, but the cleaner, the man he had passed 100 times without notice, sitting at the grand piano, playing with the grace of a master. The director could hardly believe his eyes. For a moment he thought it was a dream, but the music was too real, too perfect. Mr. Alvarez, lost in his performance, did not notice the director standing there. He continued to play, his face calm, his body moving with the rhythm. The notes filled the hall with a beauty that words could never capture. When the last phrase came, he lingered on the keys. Letting the sound fade into silence, his hands dropped slowly to his lap, his chest rising with deep breaths. Only then did he open his eyes. He gasped when he saw the director watching him. His heart nearly stopped, fear rushing through him. He stood quickly, his chair scraping the floor. He stammered, unable to speak, ashamed, afraid he had done something unforgivable. But the director did not shout, did not scold. He simply stood frozen, his eyes wide, his face pale with shock and amazement. In that moment, he knew he had discovered something precious, a hidden treasure he had overlooked for years. The simple cleaner was not just a worker in the background. He was an artist, a true musician. The silence that followed was heavy, but inside it something new was born. The turning point had come, and nothing would ever be the same again for Mr. Alvarez. The silence after the last note was sharp and heavy. The echo of Mozart still floated in the air like a ghost. Mr. Alvarez stood frozen, his hands trembling. His heart raced as he looked at the director. He wished the floor would open and swallow him. He had only wanted to play for himself, to feel alive for a few minutes. Never had he imagined anyone would hear him, let alone the director of the orchestra. The director's face was unreadable. His eyes were wide with surprise, yet his lips pressed tightly as if holding back words. For a long moment he did not move. He simply stared at the man before him, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. How could it be possible? The cleaner, the man who swept the floors, had just played Mozart with the mastery of a seasoned pianist. Mr. Alvarez quickly stepped back from the piano. Almost tripping on the chair, he lowered his head, his voice shaking. "I am sorry, sir, I should not have touched it. Forgive me. I will never do it again." His words tumbled out quickly. Filled with fear, he imagined the worst, being fired, losing the only job that put bread on his table. He clenched his fists to stop them from shaking. But the director did not shout. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his eyes still fixed on the man. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly. His voice carried both amazement and disbelief. It was not the tone of anger. It was the tone of someone trying to solve a mystery. Mr. Alvarez swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. "I did not learn formally, sir," he whispered. "I only listened to records when I was young. I tried to copy. I practiced on broken keyboards. I remember the music in my head." He lowered his gaze again, ashamed of his simple answer, ashamed that he had no proud teacher or diploma to name. The director's chest rose and fell as he listened. He could not believe what he was hearing. A man with no training, no lessons, no piano of his own, had played Mozart as if he were born for it. He felt a strange mix of emotions, wonder at the beauty he had heard, guilt for never noticing the man's hidden gift, and curiosity about how such talent could survive in silence for so long. The hall around them seemed different now. The empty seats looked like silent witnesses to the secret revealed. The grand piano, still vibrating from the music, seemed alive with truth. The director placed his hand on the piano's lid and looked at Mr. Alvarez again. "Do you know what you just did?" he asked. His voice was quiet but firm. "You played with soul, something many trained musicians cannot do." Mr. Alvarez felt tears sting his eyes. He shook his head. "I only played what I love, sir. Nothing more." His voice was soft, filled with humility. He truly believed he had done nothing special, only released the music that had lived in him for decades. But the director felt the weight of the moment. He was shocked not only by the music but by the man himself. A cleaner, overlooked and invisible, had carried a treasure greater than many who had spent years in conservatories. He thought about all the rehearsals, all the auditions, all the times he had scolded musicians for not playing with heart, and now here was a man with no stage, no audience, no pride, playing with more heart than them all. Yet deep inside, Mr. Alvarez was frightened. His secret was no longer his own, it had been exposed, and he feared what would come next. Would they mock him, laugh at him, call him foolish for daring to touch the piano? Would the director send him away, saying the hall was no place for cleaners who dreamed of music? These thoughts crushed him, stealing away the joy he had felt moments ago. The conflict inside him was heavy. He wanted to explain that he meant no harm, that he only wished to touch the piano once in a while, to feel the music again, but words failed him. He stood silently, his shoulders bent, as if waiting for punishment. The director, however, was silent too, but for a different reason. He was lost in thought. Replaying the sound in his mind, the music had moved him, touched him, and he knew such a thing could not be ignored. Still, he also understood the world could be cruel. A cleaner becoming a pianist was not something people would easily accept. There would be questions, doubts, and perhaps even resistance at that moment. The two men stood in the empty hall, caught between two worlds, one man burdened by fear of losing everything, the other burdened by the knowledge that he had just discovered greatness in the most unexpected place. The director took a slow breath, his eyes softening. He knew he had to make a choice, and Mr. Alvarez, standing nervously by the piano, knew his life was about to change. Whether for better or worse, only time would tell. The director stood quietly, his sharp eyes still fixed on Mr. Alvarez. The silence stretched. But it was not the kind of silence that demanded punishment. It was the silence of wonder, of discovery. Finally, the director spoke again, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Tell me honestly, where did you truly learn to play like that?" Mr. Alvarez shifted nervously, his hands twisting together. He looked at the floor, afraid to meet the director's gaze. "I never had lessons, sir," he said softly. "When I was young, I listened to music on old records. Mozart was my favorite. I tried to copy it on broken keyboards. Sometimes even on tables, I remembered the sound in my head. I kept it alive." His words were humble, almost apologetic, as if he felt guilty for not having a proud story to tell. The director raised his eyebrows. "You mean to tell me, no teacher, no conservatory, no formal practice, and yet you can play like that?" His voice was filled with disbelief. For him, it was almost unthinkable. He had spent his whole life around trained musicians, some of them brilliant, but many lacked the natural feeling he had just heard from this cleaner. Mr. Alvarez nodded slowly. "I only learned by listening, sir, and by loving the music, I cannot read notes, I only remember them, I carry them here, he said, gently pressing his hand against his chest. His eyes glistened, but his voice stayed steady. The director's heart stirred. He had judged countless auditions. He had corrected countless players. He had told them again and again that music is not only about technique, but about soul. And here stood a man who had no training, yet played with more soul than most. The irony was sharp, and it humbled him. The director stepped closer, his shoes tapping softly on the wooden floor. Do you understand, Mr. Alvarez, what you have done tonight? His tone was no longer strict. It carried curiosity and even respect. You played Mozart in a way that touched me, and I am not easily touched. You played as if the music lived inside you. Mr. Alvarez lowered his head again. It does live inside me, sir, but I never thought anyone else would hear it. I only play when I am alone. It is like a secret friend I keep close to my heart. His words were simple, but they carried weight. The director looked at him carefully, studying the man beyond the uniform, beyond the broom and mop. For the first time, he saw not a cleaner but a musician hidden in plain sight. He thought of all the times he had walked past this man, never imagining the fire that burned quietly within him. Why did you never tell anyone? The director asked. His voice softer now, almost gentle. Mr. Alvarez gave a small, sad smile. Who would listen, sir? I'm only a cleaner. People see the uniform, not the man. They would laugh if I said I wanted to play the piano, so I kept it to myself. I thought it was safer that way. The director felt a pang of guilt. He knew Mr. Alvarez was right. The world often ignored people like him. People judged by titles, by positions, by appearances, and rarely looked deeper. But tonight had proved how wrong that could be. Do you know, the director said slowly, that many musicians spend years trying to play Mozart with feeling, and yet most fail. They get lost in the notes, in the rules, but you, without any of that, brought the music to life. His voice carried admiration, something Mr. Alvarez had never expected to hear. For a moment, the cleaner felt his chest tighten. He had always dreamed of such recognition, but hearing it aloud made him almost afraid, as if it might vanish if he believed it too much. I only did what I love, he whispered. The director nodded, his expression thoughtful. He realized he could not let this gift remain hidden. It would be wrong to leave such talent in the shadows. He took a deep breath and said firmly, This cannot stay a secret, you must play again. Not just for yourself, but for others. People need to hear you. Mr. Alvarez froze, fear flashing in his eyes. The thought of playing in front of others terrified him. He shook his head quickly. No, sir, please, I cannot. I am not a real musician. I have no training, no confidence. I will make mistakes. People will laugh at me. His voice cracked with panic. The director raised his hand to stop him. No, Mr. Alvarez, you are wrong. You are more of a musician than many who stand proudly on that stage. What you have is rare, it cannot be wasted. His words were strong, filled with conviction. Mr. Alvarez felt torn. A part of him wanted to hide, to keep his secret safe, but another part of him, the boy who once dreamed of pianos and symphonies, stirred with hope. The director's words were like fire, burning away years of silence, yet the fear still clung to him, whispering that dreams were dangerous. The hall was quiet again, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence before something great, a silence holding possibility. The director and the cleaner stood facing each other, one urging, the other resisting, but both knowing that a door had been opened, a door that could never be fully closed again. That night, a breakthrough had begun. The world had not yet heard Mr. Alvarez, but the first step had been taken and destiny was waiting. The following week, the concert hall was alive with its usual energy. Musicians carried their instruments, chatting and tuning as they prepared for rehearsal. The director walked onto the stage with a strange light in his eyes. He looked more serious than usual, but there was also something hidden behind his face, something none of them could guess. At the back of the hall, Mr. Alvarez stood nervously, still in his cleaner's uniform. His hands trembled as he held his cap. He had tried to refuse the director's idea many times. He had said again and again that he was not ready, that he was not worthy, but the director had insisted, saying talent like his could not be hidden forever, and so against his fear he had agreed to play. The director raised his hand to quiet the orchestra. Today, he said firmly, we will witness something different, something that will remind us all what music truly is. The musicians exchanged puzzled looks. They had no idea what he meant. Then the director turned his head toward Mr. Alvarez. "Come, sit at the piano." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. The musicians whispered to each other, staring at the cleaner. Some frowned, thinking it must be a joke. Others looked curious, wondering what the director was planning. Mr. Alvarez felt their eyes like heavy stones on his back. His heart pounded. His legs shook as he walked slowly toward the piano. Every step felt longer than the last. When he reached the instrument, he sat carefully on the bench. His fingers hovered above the keys, but he could not bring himself to play. He looked up at the director, his eyes pleading. "Please, sir." "They will laugh at me," he whispered. The director leaned forward and said quietly, "They will not laugh once they hear you. Trust the music. Let it speak for you." Taking a deep breath, Mr. Alvarez closed his eyes. His fingers pressed the first notes. Soft and trembling at first, the room filled with sound. The whispers of the musicians fell silent. The notes floated like delicate wings, fragile but beautiful. Slowly, his fear melted, and the music grew stronger. His fingers moved faster, more confident. The hall was no longer filled with doubt, but with Mozart. Alive and shining, the musicians sat frozen, their mouths slightly open. Some had begun the moment with smirks, but now their faces softened. They could not believe what they were hearing. This was not the playing of a man who cleaned floors. This was the playing of someone born with music in his soul. The piano sang under his touch, full of emotion, full of truth. The director stood with pride, watching every reaction. He had known this would happen. He had known they would be shocked as the piece continued. He saw tears glistening in the eyes of a few musicians. They were professionals trained for years. Yet many of them had never felt the music this deeply. Mr. Alvarez lost himself in the sound. For the first time, he was not hiding. For the first time, he was sharing what had always lived inside him. The notes rose higher, faster, more powerful, filling every corner of the hall. It was no longer a rehearsal, it was a performance. The musicians were no longer an audience, they were witnesses. When the final note faded into silence, the hall held its breath for a long moment. Nobody moved, nobody clapped, nobody spoke. They were stunned, unable to process what had just happened. Then slowly, hands began to come together. The sound of applause filled the hall, soft at first, then louder, stronger. Rising into thunder, Mr. Alvarez opened his eyes. His face pale with shock, he had expected laughter, rejection, but instead he saw admiration. The musicians were on their feet, clapping for him. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others smiled with genuine respect. For the first time in his life, he was not invisible, he was seen, truly seen. The director stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You see," he said warmly, "I told you they would not laugh, they would only listen, and now they know the truth." His voice carried pride but also relief, for he had taken a risk. But it had been worth it. Tears welled in Mr. Alvarez's eyes. He lowered his head, overwhelmed by emotion. "I never thought this day would come," he whispered. His voice cracked, his hands shook as he pressed them against his chest. He felt as if years of silence had suddenly broken, releasing a flood of light. The musicians gathered around him. Some asked how he had learned. Others simply thanked him for reminding them of what music really meant. It was not about fame, not about technique alone. It was about heart, about soul, about truth. And that truth had come from a man they had once passed by without a glance. That day changed everything. The cleaner was no longer just a shadow in the hall. He had stepped into the light. His music had spoken louder than words, louder than uniforms, louder than prejudice. He was not just Mr. Alvarez the cleaner anymore. He was Mr. Alvarez the musician. From that day on, Mr. Alvarez's life was never the same. The man who had once walked through the concert hall unseen, carrying a mop and broom, was now looked at with new eyes. Wherever he went, people whispered, some with amazement, some with curiosity. They could not believe that a cleaner had played Mozart like a master. They could not believe such beauty had been hidden in plain sight for so long. The director spoke often about him. Whenever reporters or guests came to the hall, he would say, "Sometimes greatness is found where you least expect it." I learned that from Mr. Alvarez. These words spread, and soon, more people began to ask about the humble cleaner who had stunned an orchestra. For Mr. Alvarez, it was overwhelming. He had never wanted fame. He had never dreamed of applause. All he had ever wanted was to touch the piano, to let the music inside him breathe. And yet now the world was hearing it too. Some nights he still went home quietly to his small room, sitting on his bed with disbelief, asking himself if it was all real. The musicians who once passed him without a glance now greeted him warmly. Some even asked for his advice. They wanted to know how he played with such feeling. He always smiled gently and said, "I only play with my heart. That is all I know." His words were simple, but they carried wisdom that no textbook could teach. The director began inviting him to sit at the piano more often, at first only during rehearsals, then at small gatherings. Eventually, he insisted that Mr. Alvarez play at a concert, a real performance with a real audience. The thought terrified him, but the director reassured him, "You were born for this. You just didn't know it yet." And so, the man who had once been invisible found himself under the bright lights of the stage. When he played, the audience sat in silence. Hanging on every note, many wept, not only because of the music, but because of the story behind it. They saw in him a truth about life, that talent does not always come from grand schools or rich families. Sometimes it comes from the quiet hearts of ordinary people. Afterward, people would approach him with tears in their eyes. Some said, "You reminded me why I love music." Others said, "You give me hope." He listened humbly, always lowering his head, never letting pride control him. For him, he was still the same man. Still Mr. Alvarez. He cleaned when he needed to. He lived simply. But now he also carried the gift of inspiring others. He often thought back to the years of silence, the years of sweeping floors while music burned inside him. At times he regretted not having the chance earlier. But then he would smile softly and say to himself, perhaps the time had to be right. Perhaps the music needed to wait for the right moment to be heard. The director, too, changed because of him. He no longer judged musicians only by their training. He listened deeper, searching for the soul behind the notes. Whenever a young player struggled, he told them the story of the cleaner who became a master. He told them, technique will impress ears, but heart will touch souls for the hall itself. The story became legend. Staff whispered about it to newcomers. Musicians retold it to friends in faraway cities. Everyone spoke of the night the director walked in and found the cleaner at the piano. The story grew like a flame, reminding people everywhere that hidden beauty can live in unexpected places. Mr. Alvarez, however, remained humble. He never stopped cleaning when duty called, never demanded special treatment. He believed work was work and music was a gift. "I am not greater than anyone else," he often said. "I am only lucky to have found a way to let my heart speak." But those who heard him knew better. They knew they had witnessed something rare, something pure, something unforgettable. His playing was not just music, it was life itself. Poured out through his fingers years later, people still remembered. They said the sound of his piano could not be forgotten. They said his story gave them courage to follow their own hidden dreams. And whenever the director was asked about the proudest moment of his career, he never mentioned the biggest concerts or the famous names he had worked with. He only smiled and said, "The night I discovered the soul of Mozart in the hands of a simple cleaner." And so, the man who once lived in shadows became a light for others, not because he sought greatness, but because he carried music with love, because he never let his passion die, even when life gave him no chance. His story became more than music, it became a lesson, a reminder that greatness can be silent, waiting, and when it finally appears, it can change everything.